Hi, my name is Jennifer Thermes, and I'm delighted that my book, Manhattan: Mapping the Story of an Island, has been selected by New York for the Library of Congress's Great Reads from Great Places. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the book. This is the story of how humans and nature shaped Manhattan Island over the course of more than 400 years. So I have always loved New York City, and New York City is built on the island of Manhattan. I became fascinated with how this tiny sliver of land became the giant metropolis that it is today. In this book, I tell the island story using words and illustrations and lots of maps to show how the island was transformed into a city.
How did you come up with the idea for the book?
I spent hours upon hours reading books about the history of New York City, visiting museums, studying old historical maps and photographs of Manhattan, and just walking around and looking at everything, because there's always something new to see in New York City.
How does this book relate to your state?
This book talks about the melting glaciers that first formed the land, the Native Americans who lived there for thousands of years and called it Mannahatta, which is where the name Manhattan comes from, and how later Europeans came to the island to trade beaver pelts. They would add more land along the waterfront, which changed the island's shape, and you can see these changes on the maps in the book. Also, did you know that Manhattan was once covered with hills and streams and forests and farms? It would all be flattened and filled in to build the streets and wide avenues that we see today. This was called the grid, and it would completely change the island and make it possible for it to become a big city. While working on this book, I learned about bridges and skyscrapers and why Central Park was created, and how natural events like a huge blizzard would eventually lead to building the subway system underground.
Tell us something we might not know about you.
I also learned about the people who did the physical labor on the island, from the enslaved people who were first brought there by the Dutch, to immigrants who came to the island from all around the world, to Native Americans who climbed way up in the air to work on most of the city's tall buildings and bridges. Without all of these people, New York City never would have become what it is today. There are also parts of history about the island that were lost over time and later rediscovered. For example, in 1991, construction workers were digging in the ground at a building site, and they discovered human skeletons. They had rediscovered what had once been a cemetery for enslaved people in the 1700s. Today it is recognized as the African Burial Ground National Monument. I wondered about why places like this were built on top of and forgotten about for so long. This is just one of many fascinating true stories about the island that are also an important part of American history. In this book, some stories are told in the pictures without words. You can look for birds and beavers and fish and all kinds of nature, and there are children and lots of dogs running through the pages of the book. Look carefully, because some of them appear again in later scenes.
What is your favorite thing about this book?
One of my favorite things in this book is a tree that appears throughout the illustrations. It is an English elm tree that was planted around the time of the American Revolution, and it is still standing today in Washington Square Park, and you can go and see it for yourself. It is one of the oldest trees on Manhattan Island, and to me, it's a living reminder that history is all around us. We just have to open our eyes and look for it.
What is your favorite place to visit in your state?
My favorite place to visit in New York is Manhattan, but you probably guessed that already.
Tell us about your city or town.
I grew up in the town of Port Washington, which is on Long Island, which is another island that is part of New York State.
What is your favorite landmark?
My favorite human-made landmark is Grand Central Station, because it's a magnificent building and it's the first place I set foot in when I take the train to visit New York City. My favorite natural landmark is the Hudson River.
There are official state birds. There are official state trees. Is there an official state donut?
As far as I can tell, New York does not have a state donut. So I would like to nominate the Apple Crumb Donut, because one of the nicknames for New York City is the Big Apple. And New York City is the largest city in the state of New York.